my talk. My name is Heather, and I am a neurofeedback therapist. I specialize in treating individuals with developmental trauma, but also individuals with traumatic brain injuries. So I work in a clinic where we see a lot of people who've had motor vehicle accidents, but we also see a lot of individuals who have a history of abuse. For my master's thesis, I was in a trauma lab, and originally I had studied meditation. And I studied the various underpinnings, the neuroscientific underpinnings of different meditative states. And I was really interested in neurofeedback when I came across it in my second year of university, because my own experience with a car accident actually left me feeling like my brain had been rewired. And I was experiencing some dissociative states as well. And so when I had this neurofeedback therapist come into my class, and she started talking about how your brain can be rewired and how you can train yourself out of a various state, and using attention, you could learn to change how your brain is wired. I was like, oh my God, that's kind of exactly what I've been doing. But I had done it using meditation and yoga, but then I started to realize that, oh, there's actually these computer interfaces that we can use to help people understand how to do this as well. Then, right before my master's, we started coming across, and I'll get into that psychedelics were overlapping with some of our trauma research. And so then I got the benefit of studying psychedelic-informed neurofeedback. So that's what I'm going to kind of talk to you guys about today. So what I kind of want to do is take you through kind of the history of how I came to be where I am with my research. And so in many ways, we're looking at the ancestral lineage of the protocol that I designed for, or worked on for my master's. So Elmer and Alice Greene were these really cool scientists. He was a physicist, and they were just, in general, these wonderful researchers who started the Menninger Foundation. And they became really interested in hypnosis. So the fact that somebody could tell you something, and that could induce a state shift that could lead to positive outcomes was fascinating to them. Beyond that, they were also fascinated with mystics and with different yoga and meditative practices. So they started traveling around and putting it out there that, hey, if anyone has this special talent, we'd like to study you. So they went to India, and this is them studying Swami on the banks of the Ganges River. They also studied Sri Aurobindo. I think I'm saying his name wrong, but he could stop his heart, or he could take it down to the point where it was only a flutter. And so they recorded that as well. They also started studying healers. So they put them in these copper rooms. There's actually a YouTube talk where Elmer talks, and I really highly recommend you guys watch it because he's really sweet and cute. And they would just, without touching anyone, they would monitor based on the copper walls the change in the energy in the room. And then somebody commented, wow, maybe it's just because they're waving their hands around. So then they put them in a separate room, and they found that they would still get an effect. So they literally have findings on some of these mystical practices way back in like the 70s. And all the data is there, and they've written it in their books. And so one of the things they became really interested in was the theta state, or the twilight, or the hypnagogic state, because they recognized that these mystics were often entering into those states as well, and that it was a very creative state. On top of that, alpha seemed to be a part of understanding self, and they noticed that the alpha frequency would also change. So one of the more famous and well-researched protocols in neurofeedback is called alpha theta. And I've done training in this, and I've worked with clients with it as well. And so you bring a client in, and you put an electrode on the back of their head, right over the precuneus, and you talk to them about what it is they're there for. A lot of people use this for creativity, but a lot of people use this to go into more of a hypnotic state where they can recover some of their traumas and start to process them. So if a client came in, or addictions actually, it's really useful for addictions as well. So say someone wants to quit drinking, they would sit down, and I would have them imagine that they were in the bar and they were refusing the drink. And they let that image kind of play onto their mind, and then they close their eyes, and then there's two tones. There's a tone for alpha and a tone for theta. Theta is this oceanic sound, and alpha is this babbling brook. They don't need to know anything, they just close their eyes and they listen to the shifting. Now, we're rewarding theta and kind of inhibiting alpha. So as that happens, as theta goes up, you go into more of this trance state. And they were finding all kind of positive outcomes. People would process their trauma, they became more creative, addictions would be cured. It's actually well validated and well used within neurofeedback practices. But one of the coolest things I think about working with neurofeedback, and one of the lasting messages that I got out of the Greene's book, was that they talked about that brainwave patterns have no associated sensory process that will allow us to detect them. What we sense and control is not the brainwave itself, but it's the meta state, or it's that state of consciousness that's the concatenation, or the group of subtle existential cues. So you're developing the subtle awareness. So one of the other things he discovered is that by warming your hands, or imagining that you can warm your hands, you can almost eliminate migraines. So he had serendipitously hooked someone up, and he noticed that this woman suddenly had this explosion of heat in her hands. And he said to her, "Whoa, what happened there?" And she's like, "What? How did you know that my migraine went away?" And so by increasing the heat in the hands, which is a relaxation response, it's a sign that the nervous system has calmed, and the blood isn't flowing into your head and into your organs because you're going to run from a tiger. You're actually in a parasympathetic grounded place. That can relieve migraines. So they started training people, and you can go out and you can get like a $20 thermometer, and you can start training your temperature control. And children learn this incredibly quickly. And he tells a story about a doctor who took him 2 years to learn. He's like, "Well, why did the children learn so quickly?" He said, "Well, the children don't have a belief about what's possible. They believe anything is possible. So if you believe it's possible, then sometimes you can actually train yourself there a little bit quicker." So it's through the use of this increased awareness that our bodies can come to function more optimally. That's why we often refer to biofeedback training as awareness training. And I see attention as one of our most amazing commodities, but it's also the commodity that's being bought and sold the most in our culture today. Your attention is so valuable. The more attention you put into your device, the more attention you put into anything. That's what marketing is all about. But your attention is also the most powerful tool you have to work within your own states and to kind of wake yourself up to different capacities you have naturally. But a lot of us aren't exercising that to its full capacity because we've kind of forgotten, and that's not the focus of our culture, which I'll get into a little later. So Barry Sturman is master of the space cats. This is one of my favorite stories in neurofeedback. So NASA was sending astronauts into space, and the astronauts were hallucinating that people were waving to them from Earth. And it turned out that the rocket fuel was giving them seizures in their temporal lobes. So they were having hallucinations. And they were like, "Oh, that's bad. We can't have astronauts who can't focus and are thinking that, random things are happening." So somebody had heard about Barry Sturman's research, and he was actually a sleep researcher, and he had been doing research with cats. And he had recognized that by monitoring their brain waves, there's a specific brain wave that right before they pounce, it's called the sensory motor rhythm, it gets really quiet. So he was like, "Oh, maybe if I train that in them, they'll sleep better." So he started training these cats, and they seemed to become more calm, but he didn't find any implications for sleep. So he kind of thrown it away, but people had heard about his research, and so NASA went to him and said, "Maybe there's something you can do for us." So he started, this is a sad story, I'm sorry for those of us and all of us who love animals. He started exposing the cats to rocket fuel. And he noticed that half of the cats died and half of the cats lived. But the cats who lived were the cats who had had their sensory motor strip trained. So serendipitously, he found, it's not completely a cure, but it is a treatment for epilepsy. So using biofeedback training, this is also another training that is well documented and well used in epilepsy. Just by training your sensory motor strip or your sensory motor rhythm, you can reduce the amount of seizures that you're having. So I love this quote by Jung. I think everyone's probably familiar with it. "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." What I recognize, and primarily because I work with a lot of individuals with trauma, that this is true. And I think all of us recognize that we have patterns and habits and things that we do that we're kind of like, "Why did I do that again?" And it's just your subconscious cues based on your history and your patterns and the way your little neural networks were formed, because what fires together wires together. So the more you repeat a thought, the more you repeat a habit, the more you repeat a pattern, the more it becomes who you are. So what I'm going to talk about is brainwaves, and we're going to go through kind of the subconscious states up to the conscious states, but also going through our most primal development of our system, up to our cognitive or cortical development of our system to try to give a sense of how much of our subconscious is directed by certain frequencies, and that with neurofeedback training, you can learn to make your subconscious conscious. So the first one is delta, and that's the brainstem. So the brainstem is a thing we share with reptiles, and it controls a lot of our subconscious processes. So your heart rate and your digestion are all generated and kind of regulated through the delta rhythm. Delta is also something that you see a lot in sleep, and that's because the cortex, which job it is to inhibit the rest of the frequencies, is off because you're sleeping. So the subconscious is allowed to come through. But I'll also see a lot of delta in someone who has a traumatic brain injury, and sometimes in people who have trauma as well, because that inhibiting capacity has been damaged for a different reason other than when you sleep and it naturally turns off. Although meditators, there are some meditators that will also generate a rich delta rhythm, and that is a sign of their connection with their subconscious. Theta, which I talked about before, is a very intuitive state, and it's generated by the limbic system. And your limbic system is your emotional state, your emotional self, and this is what kind of separates us from reptiles. It's what allows us to care and connect with one another. There's more layers involved in that, but this is one of them. And it's also the hypnagogic state. This is also where children are. Children are constantly in this theta state, so they're in this really imaginary, open, playful place. Alpha is generated by the thalamus. And the thalamus is like Grand Central Station in your brain. So all the information comes up through the thalamus, then it gets sent to the cortex, but then the cortex sends it back to the thalamus, and it's like these loops of information. The thalamus, or the alpha rhythm, gets disrupted in autism, and there's actually something called the mu rhythm. So if you do a diffusion tensor image of someone's brain with a mu rhythm, you'll see that all of their networks are going straight into the sensory motor strip. So instead of it actually being sent throughout the cortex for processing, usually information goes to the back of the head, input, then the center, processing, and then the front, output. But it comes up through the body, and then it's channeled that way, and then of course it goes back down. These individuals, all the information just goes boop, straight to the sensory motor strip. So it's like everybody's screaming at you and everything just like flying at you all the time because there's no subtle processing of any of the cues. There's quite a bit of neurofeedback researchers working on the mu rhythm, and they have been successfully showing that you can adapt that, especially the younger you work with someone, but even some older patients, to start to make it a little more diffuse. You also see this in individuals with traumatic brain injury, a disruption in their alpha rhythm, because these vertical connections to the cortex get severed when you hit your head. You also see with individuals with trauma that they have a smaller alpha frequency, and that's often tied to a disembodiment. I don't want to feel. It doesn't feel good to feel. Bad things have happened. I've learned not to feel. So there's different reasons for alpha to be disrupted, but in the end, the thalamus is kind of like Grand Central Station for your senses. Then we have the cortex, which is our most recent part of our brain, and this is where all of our logical thinking happens. It's broken up into 3. So the sensory motor strip is the slower. Then you have, it's about 12 to 15. 15 to 19 is on task, and anything above that is kind of stress. So the way you could imagine it is, I'm sitting and I'm watching a sunset and I'm chill. I'm in my sensory motor rhythm, everything's nice. Then someone starts walking towards me and I orient. So now I'm in 12 to 15, or 15 to 19. I'm like, what's going on? I need to think about this. Then you realize it's someone you don't like. So you're like, crap. So you tense up. The last is gamma. I'm fascinated with gamma because it's been shown in a lot of meditation research. Gamma is actually tied to kind of like, in my understanding of it, and I think there's a lot of debate on this because they think there could be muscle artifact that's interfering with it, but it seems to be the emergent property of everything else working well together. So these high elite meditators tend to have a lot of gamma because their brain is just functioning really well, and you'll almost see less than normal kind of means of the other frequencies because they're not kind of revving up. So a gamma is a, yeah?
I actually understand. These are, you're putting what, like electrodes on, you're measuring the electrical output of the brain's frequencies and seeing like where the peaks are?
Yeah, that's in different parts. This is, I'm showing where the brainwaves are generated.
Right, but those are the, that's how they measure it, and then they figured out eventually that that's associated with different parts. Okay.
Yeah, in different parts of the brain, It gets really complex, which sensor should have more of one frequency or less. For example, depression, too much alpha in the left hemisphere is often what you'll see, but it can also be too much on the back of the head too.
Okay.
And so then I want to train that down. Or the individual trains it down. I reward them to train it down.
Okay.
Yes?
So there was a physical connection with the gamma, like the gamma waves.
Mm-hmm.
Can it be explained something like how, like the state of mind where like a boxer or a race car driver is in a reactive state, where they're kind of like so in
flow,
focused.
in a flow state?
Yeah, in a flow state, yeah.
Yeah, gamma can often be associated with flow states as well. Yeah. All right, so Kamiya in 1970 was the guy who kind of figured out that we could control our alpha rhythm. And so we hooked a bunch of grad students up to different devices and gave them a bell and found that, we could learn to increase alpha. One thing we know with alpha is when you close your eyes, it should naturally go up because all of your external sensory information goes away, so you're more internally oriented, and alpha has a lot to do with our internal state. But in trauma, we often see, kind of like I had mentioned, when they close their eyes, it drops because they stay dissociated. They don't go in, they don't want to feel. It's not a connection that will get bigger. And with, what's his name? Jim Hart, there's the Biocybernaut Institute, which is out in Vancouver. And he was one of these grad students, and they forgot him in the basement and left him there. And so he just kept training his alpha up and up and up and up. And I was lucky enough to have a conversation with him, which was really funny. And he talked about how he just started exploring space and going to all of these different places. And something that's really important to know about alpha then is there's synchronized alpha and there's desynchronized alpha. So if we squash something, it's desynchronized. The synchrony is lost. It goes down. But then there can be rebound effects. But if we increase something, there's a synchronization. So what Jim Hart has done is he's working on alpha synchronization. So you see alpha synchronization in meditators as well. So it's not only the amplitude of the frequency, but it's also the synchrony. And there's also things known as coherence, which is like how well is it connected, and then phase, which is how fast is the information transfer, but I'm gonna try not to get too off this way, which I do. All right. So we got brain waves, but then you also need to understand the intrinsic connectivity networks. So who here has heard of the default mode network? I feel it's like the most famous thing in psychedelic research right now. Okay. One way to look at these networks is to imagine that you're sitting on a plane and you open up that book that shows you where all the flights are going. And those nodes, like Pearson is one of them, and JFK is another one. It's like these huge points of information transfer, right? So these are massive points of information transfer in the brain. And we've found that these three main hubs kind of underlie a lot of our mental health. And if these become dysregulated, it dysregulates a lot of different things. So the default mode network is tied to self-referencing, so our sense of self. The salience network kind of indicates whether we're hyper or hypo-aroused, and it's the mind-body connection. And when you think salience, it's what do you notice? What are you salient to inside? What are you salient to outside? The central executive network, or the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, is not an actual part of the brain as much as it's a functional part of the brain. It's like one of the last things to develop. Myelination of your prefrontal cortex happens around the age of 21. So there's a huge developmental shift at 21. So if you notice, if anyone remembers being 21 or everyone isn't 21 yet, it's kind of confusing. At 21, you're like, it's suddenly like the captain of the ship comes online and you're like, who am I? Oh, wow, I can watch myself. What's going on? What is this thing that's happening? One of the ways that I try to explain this to my clients is by using a waterfall metaphor. And I'll be honest, this came to me in a vision 7 years ago, where I was like, after this big retreat that I had done, I was like, what the heck did that mean? And as I've come to understand the salience and default and the central executive, I was like, oh, this actually might be a really useful metaphor. So imagine the cave is the default, the water is the salience, and the central executive is like outward orientation, kind of sunny day, thinking and kind of on task with the world around you. The salience network is in charge of task switching between the networks. So task negative, task positive. These are anti-correlated in normal waking consciousness. You're either in your head or you're out. In, out, in, out. In a healthy population, 70% of our time is here, 30% is here. If you have a mental health disorder of varying degrees, but on average, especially with trauma, 70% is here and 30% is here. Why? Well, the salience network, the water's either too hot or too cold. So you're like, screw it, that's too cold, I'm not going out there. Or you're like, it's way too hot, I'm not going in here. So one of the first things I teach my clients is how to regulate their body states and their stress response, which is often driven by your beta frequency, because that high beta buzz is like having your foot on the gas pedal all day. If you cannot learn how to regulate that state, it becomes harder to know how to go inside without freaking out. And even when I was thinking about some of the psychedelic stuff, I think it naturally starts regulating beta, but at first it kind of starts taking some of the other things away. So if I have a client who has a lot of slow wave, and I take their slow wave away, and you imagine that they got their foot on the gas, I take that away, they're just like poof into the next thing. So if I calm them first, it's much easier to do this later. Does that make some kind of sense? I'm trying to.
The outside like flow, the inside like through.
But this is the best part, thank you. In psychedelics, they all unify. There is no division, it stops. There is no more three, there is one. And that's that. And it becomes, instead of top down, so the cortex inhibiting, it's bottom up. It's all the delta and everything moves forward. Yes?
Would that be a possible mechanism when people talk about having a psychedelic experience where they get a reset?
So that's what I'm going to get into a little bit more with the reset. Yes?
Maybe my question is too soon, but gamma, do you see gamma under psychedelics?
I think we do see gamma under psychedelics, but I honestly need to look into that more. So I'm not going to confidently answer you. All right. So this is Carhartt's statement. You know, high normal metabolic rate activity, the PCC. The PCC is the back of the head that underlies the precuneus, and the precuneus is the hub of the default mode network. And look at that. Look how it's innervated into the frontal lobes. It's going up into like the temporal lobes with emotion, into the insula, which is switching. So the default mode network is actually like this massive orchestrator in the brain. It takes up a lot of information and a lot of blood flow and energy in the brain. And we're also starting to associate it with our ego. And the ego death that we see in psychedelics is the shutdown of this. This gets squashed. It gets quiet. So in the lab that I was working in, we started noticing like, oh, wait a second. So this squash under a psychedelic where the default shuts down looks exactly the same as dissociation. So individuals who are dissociative are disembodied and disconnected, but it's a different kind of feeling. They're not in like a happy psychedelic state, they're in a disconnected kind of psychedelic state where everything's kind of funneling at them. If you imagine a bad psychedelic trip, that's kind of what it's like to be in a dissociative state on some level. So with PTSD, this dysregulation across all the networks, it's not just in the default mode network, it's in the central executive and everything else, which is slightly tied to that default being shut down. So we have issues with facial emotional processing, autobiographical recall, dysregulated arousal and interoceptive processing, and that ties into the main hubs of the central executive, the intrinsic connectivity networks. And like I had talked about, that the insula is the thing that switches between these two. In my lab, they found that if we just take the alpha rhythm and we put a sensor, just like with alpha theta, on the back of the head, and we train that down, so we desynchronize it, it brings about a rebound. So when alpha goes down, there's a lot of work to try to bring alpha up in clients who need it, and it's really hard to do. But if you squash it, then it goes boing and comes back up. And we've all seen those psychedelic images that after a psychedelic experience, there's suddenly this increased connectivity. Well, neurofeedback has been shown to do something similar. And that shift in the amygdala complex was associated with a reduction in arousal, PTSD, symptom severity, greater synchronization afterwards. And then Michael Winkelmann recently published a paper, and he was looking at psilocybin and LSD, and he found, which I found was really interesting, that you see something very similar. So you see this regulation of the amygdala. You see this regulation of the networks. And in many ways, when you squash and then it comes back up, you broaden someone's perspective. You open up their ability to think from different angles. So that's really cool. We're like, great, we know neurofeedback can do that, but why do we want to look at a psychedelic neurofeedback? What's different? Well, what makes life worth living? Positive emotion and mood, pro-social behavior, and creativity. So with alpha theta, we've seen some creativity and some pro-social and increase in positive mood. But with the actual just alpha down, we saw a regulation, but not necessarily more openness, creativity, kind of all the things that we associate with the psychedelic. So my supervisor had come across Carhartt Harris's paper from 2012, and he found that, oh hey, in psychedelics, it's not just the alpha that gets squashed, it's everything from 1 to 20. So all the bands are getting squashed, but primarily in the back of the head, in the default mode network. So we were just like, okay, well, what happens if we do that? So that was my research. It was essentially training. I trained over 100 individuals, but for this study that I'm going to present, we're just going to look at the first 23, where I just squashed the back of their head. They would watch a fractal. And what do I mean by squashing? I mean that I put a sensor on the back of their head, and I was recording their brainwaves at the same time. And they were watching fractal videos on a screen, or we watched one where it was a puzzle game where you had to reveal the puzzle pieces. When you are in a very present state and your mind is not wandering, meaning you're not self-referencing, everything moves clearly. But the second you start thinking about yourself, a white fog will come onto the screen. So it cues you to be present. It cues you not to think. It cues you into deeper states by getting that visual feedback. And we found that individuals could actually train down their own default mode network, and it led to some pretty interesting results. So one of the things we did was we collected Struder's research and data from his paper, and we compared it to our own findings. So all the participants took the OAV, the Altered State Scale, after the experience, and we found that our results were not unlike those of a psychedelic. So we saw experiences of unity, blissful state, insightfulness, some disembodiment, a reduction in anxiety, and an increase in audio-visual synesthesia. We also had a positive correlation with emotionality and absorption on the disembodiment scale. And that's really interesting because that is tied to the default mode network, showing that when you're kind of squashing that, it opens you up a little bit. But we also know that in a dissociative state, there's a sense of disembodiment. And I've personally experienced in a psychedelic, it's like the boundaries of self are kind of vanishing. So that could be potentially tied to this, decrease in the default in all of those hubs and connections with the brain. So instead of the separation of them, there's more of a unity occurring. We saw a decrease in delta, which means people were a little more present. We saw an increase in 12 to 25, which meant that they were a little more focused and on task, but in a very relaxed, I'm watching the sunset way. Theta came up, so they started entering into a trancier place. High beta went down, which means they were less stressed. Alpha also came up. We know alpha coming up is a relaxing response. And also this gamma peak as well is a sign that there was potentially more connectivity or regulation in the brain, or they were entering into more of an altered state. Okay, I'm going to quickly go through, this was actual brainwave recording of participants during the experience, and they're broken up into the smaller bandwidths, delta, theta, alpha, SMR, the other betas, and then some gammas, and this is just the whole squash and all the fast frequencies at once. And what we would see around 9 minutes is that this increase in gamma. And I saw this over and over and over again, around 8 to 9 minutes. And even in the temporal lobes, we started seeing it. And in Carhartt Harris's research on entropy, or the entropic brain theory, he talks about a decoupling between the hippocampus and the medial temporal lobes as a sign that someone's entering into an altered state. So this is something definitely worth looking into. And then participants would kind of just stay with this heightened gamma state, especially in the back, where we expect there to be a little more embodiment represented there. And this was the participants' follow-up questionnaire. So I basically emailed everyone and just a free open question How did you feel since the experience? What have you noticed? And this individual said, well, I definitely noticed a change in my mood and feeling state. I felt very relaxed and more positive about everything. Everything seemed more interesting and vivid afterward. We also noticed that overall, kind of through a thematic analysis, there was an elevation in mood, focus, more tranquility, emotions were triggered by music, more vivid dreams, senses were heightened, they felt calm and aware, time moved more slowly, personal issues were being resolved subconsciously, which seems to thematically map on to some of the microdosing research. And microdosing in many ways is just kind of also like a squash, potentially, for your default mode network, where you're having a little more connectivity, but not too much, like Sophia was talking about. So instead of taking a macro dose where your entire life changes and all the networks are squashed and then flush and you're someone completely new, it's just a little bit here and there. And I find with neurofeedback, I see very similar things in my clients. They're just slowly edging themselves to a little more self-assertion, a little more openness, a little more insight. So then I started working with Jeff from the Neuromeditation Institute. And he has figured out how to use full head cap neurofeedback training that targets specific regions associated with various meditative states. He has also moved forward with the deep states protocol that we kind of call the Psilocybin-informed protocol, and has had some interesting results by targeting these specific regions. I want to show you a video. We'll see if this works. One sec. So which one is the, oh, this, yeah. It's very quiet. So he's doing the open heart neuromeditation, but I'm mainly showing this so you can just get the visual of what the heck I'm talking about. How is this working? These are different sensors. So these are the frontal right over the eyes, C3 across the center. But in the end, what we can see is now we have live training where you can have regions of interest, and then you get feedback, usually auditory or visual, that rewards you for a change that the neurofeedback sets up.
So this 3D head image is showing us the voxels in the anterior cingulate and showing us the amount of gamma activity happening in real time as this person was doing the meditation. You can see in this instance that for most of the time it is green, which indicates a low amount of activity. And every once in a while, you see these bursts of bright color indicating an increase in activity. The next tab is identified as user of. This is actually also looking at gamma activity, but it's looking at it in a different region of the brain. This is looking at gamma activity in the insula. Now,
Which is tied to the salience network. Gamma is also tied to attention as well, and where you're focused. but in a diffuse way.
in order to get some sort of feedback. However, they also have to keep the gamma in the right insula above threshold as well. So on the other side, this yellow side, the yellow line is indicating gamma activity in the right insula. You see it moving around, and it's quite far from the threshold. The threshold is way up here. So at this point, the person is getting no feedback. I'm going to turn on a specific music soundtrack that can go along with the feedback, so that we'll get an indication that they are in the right meditative state. And right now, they're getting no feedback because what was happening was during this meditation, the person was going along getting no feedback, and I stopped them at about the 4-minute mark, which we are approaching right now, and I asked them what was happening. I paused the session, and I asked them what was going on, because this was someone who has a lot of experience with neural meditation and knows a lot about the concepts and methods of this process, and I was surprised that they were struggling as much as they were. When I asked them about what was happening, they indicated that they were puzzled why they weren't getting feedback, because they were very focused on their breath. And that was the exact problem, because they were doing a focused meditation, and this was an open heart meditation. So once we clarified what the neuro meditation session was measuring and helped them work with some specific tips and tools, we went back into the session and continued recording, and you'll see any moment now what happens. As soon as they shifted gears, look at that. Look at the activity in the right insula. It shot way up.
So they had to attend to their feeling state. It wasn't a thought process. It was an embodiment that they were not engaged in. They were focused versus feeling.
Music is letting you know that you are in the right state, that you are holding on to a specific state of consciousness. And so
All
you'll
right.
see that
So- So Jeff has since taken, like I said, my protocol, and he's really started targeting. So in the precuneus and then the middle frontal gyrus, he was doing different bands, and this is actually closer to a DMT protocol. And his participant did actually have the experience of seeing a feathery white entity presence. So she had an entity experience from the neurofeedback protocol. She also felt as if the surroundings didn't exist, and she felt as if her body tilted backwards. Body sensations of rocking and spinning and being nauseous, which I think some of us who've taken DMT may have experienced as well. So for a second, what I've done is give you guys a lot of cognitive information, and I am also getting close to running out of time, but I would like to invite you all to take a moment and just close your eyes or gaze downward, whichever is comfortable for you, and see what it would be like to shift into a feeling state. One of the best ways to do that is to feel your feet on the floor. Feel the weight of your feet pressing into the floor and the earth pressing back up into your feet. If you take long exhales and relax your body as well, can you start to feel maybe more of a warmth in your hands, a softness in your belly, a calming of your mind? What would it mean that every thought you have, instead of going into the thought, you just came back into your body? This is the kind of shift that neurofeedback invites you to do if guiding you in that direction. So the open heart meditation, for example, would be guiding you into a feeling state, but one where you're also adding the symbolic representation of loving kindness. Good. And then come back in. And just see if you notice any subtleties in that shift. You know, everyone was just thinking. I'm telling you a lot of weird stuff that maybe is new to you. I'm doing my best to try to relay it. But then you can also go into a feeling place and notice how much tension am I carrying? Is this stressing me out? Can I calm myself right now? And that ties to something that I've become very interested in, that some anthropologists have actually been talking about a lot. And that is these, the different ways we, as a culture, work with our nervous systems and with our attentional capacities. So a monophasic mindset is one in which desynchronized fast waves. So you're spending all your time out in the sun, which is pretty fun. But you're always on task. We're always driven. Go, 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 go. Do, 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 do. And it's like sitting and relaxing is like, that's a waste of time. I cannot do that. I can't feel. I don't have time for that. And so it's very sympathetic dominant, high beta, tension. And really, we only value, a lot of individuals anyways, I think in our culture prescribes anyways, this focus on normal waking consciousness. Everything else is potentially pseudoscience or weird. Or it was just a dream, it didn't mean anything. And that can lead to more of a rational, materialistic behaviorist paradigm and reductive analytic traditions. But in the past, 90% of our societies actually valued altered states of consciousness as ways of understanding information about ourselves and the world around us, our connection to others, where we are in our lives. They also valued normal waking consciousness. We're not throwing science away. We're not throwing any of that away. Beautiful, great that it's there. But what would it mean to inform our prefrontal cortex with a symbolic representation of self, to get back into our salience network, to get back into more of our right hemisphere creative or deeper delta theta states, to spend more time there, and also to spend more time in a parasympathetic state, to spend more time a little more present, a little more grounded, and this is actually more of a highly resonant gamma state as well. And Michael Pollan had a really nice quote in his book, so I'll just read it directly. The increase in entropy, which is more, I understand, as a polyphasic experience, allows 1,000 mental states to bloom. One way to think about this blooming of mental states is that they temporarily boost the sheer amount of diversity in our mental life. If problem solving is anything like evolutionary adaptation, the more possibilities the mind has at its disposal, the more creative its solutions will be. In this sense, entropy in the brain is a bit like variation in evolution. It supplies the diversity of raw materials on which selection can then operate to solve problems and bring novelty into the world. Maybe the ability to think outside the box depends on whether we recall and in effect exercise them after the experience ends. So what we've discovered we can do also with neurofeedback and database analysis is I can take a map of your brain before you get high. I can take a map of your brain the day after and the day after that. Then I can see what's changed, and I can repeatedly train you back to the afterglow. So you can continually rehearse some of the growth that you've had. On the flip side is potentially what could happen is there could be some training to soften your networks, so you're more likely to have a mystical experience. But also to understand that it's not the substance that brings that to you, it's your own attention and your own awareness and your own cultivation of this capacity, which is just a natural capacity of humans in general. And what if its potential is that a lot of our mental health disorders are tied to the lack of flexibility in our neural networks, and instead the rigidity in our neural networks might be leading us to have more anxiety and more depression, which is why things like microdosing are so positive, because they seem to soften the networks, in my view. And I've seen that when you pair neurofeedback with microdosing, it seems to go faster. It's like a massage before the training, maybe. So this is another Lumpkin quote. Cultures that are polyphasic in their approach have ordered neural networks in such a way that they can more easily access a variety of perceptual processes. This is just another way of saying what I kind of said. So again, would providing neurofeedback facilitate these enhancement or likelihood of integrating a mystical experience? So future directions would be to develop a polyphasic database. We do have databases that we train individual brains towards right now. It's like throwing breadcrumbs towards what is, normal. But what about individuals who've kind of hit normal and kind of hit polyphasic and want to go more? What would it mean to map a bunch of shamans and to map a bunch of mystics and to map all these different individuals and to kind of get a sense of what's going on there? and then to be able to even use those databases to help you go a little bit further, just deeper into self. I mean, a guide or a shaman can take you there as well, but we don't have as much access to that. And instead, we have a lot of technology, and right now our technology is just taking our attention. It's not feeding it back to us in a way that's necessarily helping us grow. Some of it does, and I think that's wonderful. So if anyone's interested in continuing this conversation, Dr. Michael Winkelman, who is an anthropologist and expert in shamanism and neuroscience, will be coming to Toronto for a workshop on May 10th. I will be there as well, and so will my friend Duran, who's a psychologist and Mexican medicine woman, and we'll be going a little bit deeper into this polyphasic, monophasic comparison, and how do we use shamanism and psychedelic plant medicines as therapeutic resource. So thank you for coming.